A woman in a Nairobi slum summed it up when asked by a UK government development worker what event she'd change in her life if she could. She replied simply, "I would be born a man." It's in these conditions that the traffickers select their victims and peddle their lies. By reinforcing a culture where women and girls are seen as commodities and possessions and lacking the worth of their male counterparts, they help create the conditions where the trade indeed flourishes. So by taking steps to root out these prejudices, to challenge these practices, we can combat trafficking, increasing real choices for women, and through them improve the wealth and health of their societies. We need to improve access to education to increase the opportunities and limit the vulnerability of girls to the false promises of the traffickers. But the benefits of educating girls go far further than this. It's simply the best investment, as study after study show, that any country can make. It's directly linked to higher economic productivity, better health, lower infant mortality, even higher agricultural yields. So if we can enable every girl across the world to get at least a secondary education, we can open up new opportunities and choices for them. We can create more prosperous countries for them and combat the poverty which makes the promises of the traffickers so difficult to resist. Now, education isn't the answer to everything. It has to be linked to job opportunities and to equality in all areas. But education is one of the key elements in a strategy to reduce human trafficking. Because by educating girls, we give them a stronger voice within their communities, give them more power over the decisions, both at a local and national level. Yet, we still have a long way to go. There are still 5 men, for example, for every woman elected to the parliaments across the world. But the greater the say women have over decision-making, the more progress there will be in bringing in the policies and changing the attitudes which contribute to the vulnerability of women. This is something especially recognised by the UN gift, and I'm delighted that I've been asked to play a part in its new Women's Leaders Council. The aim is to help push forward the agenda on women's rights and to provide a resource for advice and mentoring for women around the world to help combat trafficking. If women have more political clout, it will help, for example, step up efforts to tackle violence and abuse in the home. It's a sad fact that research has found that the majority of girls and women who have been trafficked into Europe were abused as children, either by their family or their local community. And their lack of self-worth and desperation makes them easy prey for traffickers and their local spotters. We need to create a culture where people no longer stay silent about the abuse they're suffering and where the legal systems take violence seriously. For if violence and sexual abuse in the home or community is tolerated, then it's so much easier for men to see women as commodities and accept them being bought and sold. Now, it may seem that changing the culture on domestic violence is an impossible challenge, but no, we have changed attitudes here in the UK in the last 3 decades. 30 years ago, I started work as a barrister. And then, domestic violence was actually regarded as something that was suitable for a beginner to do as a young barrister, and neither the courts nor the police took it as seriously as they should. The attitude was then that what goes on behind closed doors within a family was not the business of anyone else. Now, however, 30 years on, the authorities, the police, and society see domestic violence as a cowardly, despicable crime. As a judge, we're told these days to take it more seriously because it's such an abuse of trust. Now, if we can change attitudes in the UK like that, and indeed across Europe, then we can see it elsewhere too. Even in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which perhaps has the worst record of sexual violence in the world, the culture is slowly changing. Led by courageous women at grassroots, helped by outside legal advice, they are standing up to bring their attackers to justice. And the UN officials say that the number of rapes, though still appallingly high, has come down, or at least had before the latest outbreak of fighting and brutality. And of course, by giving women more protection over their own bodies, we help reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS, with its devastating impact in the developing world. It's of course far harder to root out violence in the home or the community if violence is all around, as is sadly the case in the DRC and in many other countries around the world. And the sad fact is that many of the countries which provide the main source of victims are scarred by conflict, ethnic tensions and civil war. It's these conflicts and the increased poverty and despair that they bring which leads so many to seek a better life elsewhere, whatever the risks. Conflict leads to a legacy of lawlessness, of destruction, of economic instability, and a rising number of orphans and widows. It also leads to violence just being accepted as the norm, where rape and abuse are commonplace, and where the breakdown of society means that the attackers are not likely to face any sanctions. Such sexual violence, as we've seen across the world, has become institutionalized, with girls and women taken captive to serve as sex slaves, as well, of course, as being coerced into fighting. Trafficking within borders is just as evil and just as damaging as that which crosses continents or national borders. We have to step up our efforts to tackle the source of these conflicts, which lead to such increases in violence, to mass migration and economic misery. The reality is, of course, that we're not going to stop migration. It's as important for the prosperity of many destination countries as it is for many of the source countries who depend on the money being sent back home. But we must work within our own countries to improve protections for migrants, and particularly for women who are far more likely to work on the margins of society. As Radhika Kumaraswamy, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, has pointed out, traffickers fish in the stream of migration, preying on the most vulnerable to supply to the most exploitative, hazardous and inhuman forms of work. This must involve more than increased action against the criminals behind this trade and exploitation. We must also offer more support to the victims, including protection schemes, safe houses, and assistance schemes. We must remember that they are not criminals, but victims of an appalling crime. They deserve and need our sympathy and help, not our condemnation.